You're listening to News from the Underground on Resistance Radio, resistradio.com. Got quite a few news stories to go through. Of course, one of the big stories in the last week has been regarding the SOPA bill that's currently going through Congress, the Stop Online Piracy Act. So there has been some news just come out about that. I'm sure you've already heard this, that there has been a delay to the vote on that bill. It's been postponed. Both that and the PIPA or Piper, however you want to pronounce it, bill, they have been postponed. I mean, I guess on one level this is, good news. If you want to look optimistically at things, you could interpret this as being a positive outcome from extensive online campaigning. But is it really positive news? It's been postponed, but that doesn't mean that this bill has been killed, and it certainly doesn't mean that another similar bill will be pushed through at some point in the future, and that's bound to happen. I mean, the internet is basically running out of the control of governments and of corporations, and they want the power back, and they want to make as much money as possible from it. And the way things are in terms of people copying all kinds of intellectual property, well, that's simply not a tolerable situation, is it? So there's no doubt that at some point in the future, more draconian laws are going to be passed, and me, you, and anybody else who uses any kind of copyrighted material could be shipped off to Guantanamo Bay in those fetching orange jumpsuits to suffer years of humiliation and torture. Yeah, it's getting scary though. I mean, last week I talked about this young guy who faces deportation to the US simply for running a website that linked to copyrighted material. And also, of course, yesterday as well, we saw the Megaupload site taken offline, and the leaders of that particular website have been arrested. I mean, I don't have a huge amount of sympathy with these people, because by all accounts they were making a huge amount of money. I just read an article earlier today about the guy behind Megaupload, a guy called Kim Schmitz is his real name, a German guy who has changed his name to Kim.com rather amusingly. He's a German guy, rather a large guy. In fact, he's fucking huge, to be honest. And he's been living the high life. Apparently lives in a multi-million-pound mansion, has a collection of cars. He actually has a YouTube channel by all accounts. I've not checked it out, but on his YouTube channel, apparently you can see him racing around in very expensive cars and frolicking with glamour models and things like this. So even though I don't have any particular sympathy with this guy, it's still pretty alarming that the US can now arrest people in a different country when the crime hasn't even been committed in the US. Well, I believe that they are alleging that some of the servers that were rented by Megaupload were in Virginia, so that's the reason they've given for being able to arrest this guy. But the guy's actually a German national, and I believe he was arrested in New Zealand. So yes, the US are really cracking down on alleged pirates, and that is worrying for anybody who engages in online piracy, or who even uses copyrighted images or anything like that. So yeah, worrying times. It does seem that everything is kind of closing in. The number of news stories I've read this week that have made me just feel like, yes, things are just closing in. Here's another story about the Parliament Square camp in, obviously, London, opposite Parliament in London. That was just closed down this week. Back on Monday, police removed those Parliament Square protesters and cleared away the tents and the sleeping equipment that had been there for, I believe, a decade. People had been actually camping out there protesting. Initially, I believe it was Iraq sanctions, when Brian Hoare, who sadly died last year, Brian Hoare started camping out there, and I think his initial protest was against the Iraq sanctions. Obviously, prior to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, these sanctions, which had resulted in the deaths of untold numbers of people in that country, and then his protest continued against the invasion of Iraq, and yeah, it's been a permanent fixture in London, basically, against war, against imperialism. But it's not there anymore. The authorities tried to get it removed for a long time. They managed to get the people removed from the actual square itself, but then people moved onto the pavement, and because there wasn't a law to get rid of them, of course a law had to be invented and then passed to get rid of them, and this law was the Police Reform and Social Responsibility Bill, and this created an amendment that outlawed the setting up in Parliament Square of any tent or any other structure that is designed or adapted for the purpose of facilitating sleeping or staying in. Yeah, so that's gone now, because they want that place back, and they claim that tourists were being put off from going to that area and enjoying that location. Well, actually, I went down to the Parliament Square camp back in April, when myself and Keelan and Red, a couple of the other hosts on Resistance Radio, we were in London for the royal wedding. Not celebrating the happy occasion, we were there protesting the royal wedding, and we actually ended up down at the Parliament Square pavement camp, and it was a really good atmosphere, really positive atmosphere. Nice to meet the people down there. Had some good chats to some of the regular protesters down there, and from what I could see, the tourists and passers-by weren't being deterred by that protest. They were actually pretty interested in it. There were lots of people checking out the signs. People were stopping, finding out what was going on. The protesters were talking to passers-by, and yeah, it was a wholly positive atmosphere. But of course, being opposite Parliament and being a permanent reminder to the occupants of the Houses of Parliament that not everyone goes along with their warmongering agenda, well, it had to be removed, didn't it? And so it has been. Also, of course, this week we have seen a ruling that the Occupy London protesters are to be evicted. So another protest that's going to be cleared out. This, of course, is the protest that's been going on since, I believe, October. Initially, it was a plan to occupy the London Stock Exchange, but because that was private property, the protesters weren't allowed in there, so they occupied the space between the London Stock Exchange and the cathedral, St Paul's Cathedral. And I know there were quite a few of Resistance Radio down there on the first day and stayed the first night. But yes, now the City of London Corporation has won its High Court case to evict them. I believe the protesters there have a week to appeal against this, but after 7 days, basically they can be forcibly removed from that place, from that space. So another protest camp is going to bite the dust. You know, it's the double standards of our leaders who support these kinds of protests in foreign countries, such as Egypt, as one prime example, and who are forever bleating about the British right to protest and how we should all respect the rights to protest in this country. But as soon as it becomes inconvenient, as soon as it goes on for longer than one day, longer than one march around the streets and then back home again for supper, well, that ain't acceptable, is it? And that has to be dealt with, and it's going to be dealt with. So we'll have to see what happens with the Occupy movement in London. I mean, they have occupied the former bank, so yeah, who knows what's going to go on with that. I mean, you know, there are, you know, lots of people have questions about the Occupy movement, and yeah, we'll just have to see what happens with it, basically. But you know, this is Britain now. The right to protest is limited to tame one-day marches, which, you know, you have to say don't really achieve anything. We saw 1 million people on the streets of London protesting the cuts, and what came of that? Well, absolutely nothing. If those 1 million people had stayed in the centre of London, maybe something would have happened, but yeah, everyone went home at the end of the day, and that was that, basically. Another story relating to this closing in, this sense that all kinds of protests is just being squashed, is relating to Catling, the Catling of protesters. Because another story this week, Catling protesters is lawful, appeal court rules. Catling, of course, is when the police forcibly contain protesters and refuse them the opportunity to move, basically. Forced containment, which was used during it's been used several times since the G20 protests in London 3 years ago, but that was really the kind of beginning of this Catling tactic. The G20 protest 3 years ago, of course, was when Ian Tomlinson was murdered. We've all seen those images of Ian Tomlinson trying to get home in front of the police line, and then a copper lunges forward, shoves him in the back. Ian Tomlinson goes flying and subsequently dies, you know, outright murder. And also at these protests, yes, Catling was taking place, and crowds of peaceful protesters were being surrounded by cops and battened by cops as well. Even though they weren't engaged in any kind of violence, they were being twatted by riot cops, basically. Videos shot on the day showed demonstrators, who numbered around 4,000, trying to avoid being beaten by raising their hands in the air and chanting, "This is not a riot," at police wearing helmets and riot gear. Well, I mean, some of these people actually did go to court over this Catling, and the High Court originally ruled that it was unlawful. Last year, High Court judges decided that officers acted unlawfully in 2 respects during the protests and criticised them for using force. But this went to the appeal court, and yes, this week it's now been upheld as lawful. The appeal court overturned a previous ruling by the High Court on the controversial technique deployed to contain demonstrators during the climate camp sit-in. Lord Neuberger, the master of the rolls, Neuberger, maybe pronounce it Neuberger in English. I'm saying it the German way there. Lord Neuberger, the master of the rolls, sitting in the Court of Appeal with Lord Justice Hughes and Lord Justice Sullivan, declared that the lower court's finding was flawed and allowed the appeal by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. In their decision, the appeal court judges said there was no valid basis for concluding that Chief Superintendent Johnson's decision to contain the climate camp at 7 p.m. on the 1st of April 2009 was unlawful, as his apprehension that a breach of the peace was imminent was a reasonable view for him to have formed in the light of the information available to him at the time. And this despite the fact that the protesters hadn't been excessively violent. This was even implied by the judges. So yes, even if you go on one of these one-day protests now, you face the quite realistic prospect of being forcibly contained and twatted with a truncheon. And if you try and stay there, you might last a few weeks, but the authorities will get rid of you eventually. This is the state of protest in Britain now. Despite, as I mentioned, our government defending protests in foreign countries when it's in their interest to do so, when they oppose a certain government in a foreign country. They're all in favour of democratic protest, but when it's in their own backyard, definitely not. And when protests happen in countries where the government is using totally unacceptable violence, but that government is friends with the West, a good example being in Bahrain, which I mentioned at the end of last week's show. I've just been reading some more today about the human rights abuses that have been taking place in Bahrain. Really terrible stuff going on there against the pro-democracy demonstrators. The crackdown by the authorities in Bahrain has been as brutal as Assad has been accused of carrying out in Syria. But isn't it funny how we don't hear about that? We don't hear about the US or Britain demanding military intervention in Bahrain. Why not? Well, because of course the US Fifth Fleet is based there. And that's very important in terms of securing the Strait of Hormuz, which is something I'm going to be talking about in the second half of the show. But I'm just going to take a quick break, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes, guys. Alright, welcome back to News from the Underground with me, Britt. Hope you're doing well tonight. As always, please do check out the website That's resistradio.com. If you haven't subscribed to my latest YouTube channel, that's Resistance Brit. So basically I upload these shows there as in higher quality audio. So yeah, go and subscribe to Resistance Brit. So before the break, I was just talking about some of the stories in the news this week, and let's continue with another story that's been making headlines today, and that's regarding David Cameron's calls for popular capitalism, and also about Sir Fred Goodwin, the former head of the Royal Bank of Scotland. He's been in the news as well. He seems to be kind of a scapegoat for a lot of the stuff that's going on at the moment. Sir Fred Goodwin. Let's just remind ourselves who this guy is. Well, he was the former boss of the Royal Bank of Scotland, which of course was the bank that had to be bailed out with £45 billion worth of taxpayers' money in October 2008, and basically Sir Fred Goodwin was blamed for this, and yeah, there's a massive outcry because he was like awarded some ridiculously huge pension. I think it was £700,000 a year he was to be paid in pension. Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, he's the guy that seems to be getting the blame for everything that happened at the Royal Bank of Scotland. Apparently, the big problem started when the Royal Bank of Scotland tried to take over a Dutch bank, ABN AMRO. This was in 2007, just before the credit crunch, the so-called credit crunch started. Yeah, he's getting the blame for everything that happened at the Royal Bank of Scotland, even though the Royal Bank of Scotland shareholders actually voted for the takeover of this bank, which led to these massive financial problems. The shareholders voted for it, and the entire board of the bank backed him in his efforts to take over the Dutch bank. So, you know, to what extent he was solely responsible for what happened at the Royal Bank of Scotland, I'm not really sure, but it's quite clear now that he's being made the scapegoat for what happened there. And we see Ed Miliband demanding that he be stripped of his knighthood. He was knighted back in 2004. He was actually Forbes magazine's Businessman of the Year, and then in June 2004 he was knighted for his services to banking. So we've got all these people now demanding he be stripped of his knighthood. Well, I mean, yeah, great, yeah, strip him of his knighthood, but you know, that's not really going to make amends for what's gone down over the last few years, has it? And the outright fraud and outright theft that's happened over the last few years. You know, how much money have the British taxpayers lost in having to bail out institutions such as the Royal Bank of Scotland that lost money through speculation, through gambling. So for the criticism to be reduced to Sir Fred Goodwin losing his knighthood, well, it doesn't mean a great deal, does it really? And yes, we hear David Cameron talking about popular capitalism. You know, obviously the widespread feeling of anger at the banksters, even though that anger hasn't, you know, violently expressed itself. I mean, the extent of the anger has been the Occupy London protest, and that's practically being closed down now. But I mean, there is a kind of a widespread dissatisfaction with the banks, isn't there? And obviously the government have to make some token gesture towards this, and that's what David Cameron's been doing with his talk of popular capitalism. Let me just pull up a story about that. It's quite interesting. He came out and he was talking about capitalism, moral capitalism, and promising to rein in the bonus payments of banksters, even though the RBS chief executive, who's called Stephen Hester, is currently in line for a bonus of about £1 million. The Prime Minister promised to keep a lid on bonuses at the Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds Banking Group. Despite his tough language, Stephen Hester, the RBS chief executive, could still be in line for a bonus of about £1 million on top of his £1.2 million salary. The RBS board wants to reward Mr. Hester for his part in turning the bank around by giving him a windfall of between £1.3 million and £1.5 million for 2011. But ministers are nervous about the public reaction because RBS was bailed out with £45 billion worth of taxpayers' money. Yes. So Cameron gives this speech in which he makes the right noises, talks about the need for a new moral capitalism, but what does that equate to in real terms when bankers are still being given huge bonuses, like Stephen Hester, when the banks have got away with so much taxpayers' money? How many of these bankers that committed fraud in the run-up to this economic crisis, how many of those have actually been prosecuted and gone to prison? For all this talk of popular capitalism, there's been no punishments meted out to the people who caused this crisis in the first place. And in this speech, Cameron talked about the importance of free markets, which was quite ironic because in a true free market these banks wouldn't have been bailed out in the first place. They would simply have been left to collapse. Just have to listen to the anarcho-capitalist argument about true free markets and compare that to the free markets that David Cameron talks about. So yeah, it's funny that he talks about the importance of free markets when that's not what we've got at all in Britain. We've got a system whereby the banksters run the government. When they run up losses through their own greed, through their own gambling, then the taxpayers are forced to bail them out. The taxpayers had no option in bailing out these banks. The money was simply taken from their taxes. And as I said, in a true free market, that simply couldn't have happened. The banks would have been left to collapse under the weight of their own losses. I'm not 100% convinced by the free market capitalist, the anarcho-capitalist perspective. I do find it very interesting, but I'm not 100% convinced by it. But yeah, it's definitely interesting, worth looking into if you haven't researched that. Definitely worth researching a bit. Yes, so lots of talk of popular capitalism, even though the banksters are still receiving massive bonuses, and even though the British taxpayers' money is going to pay for the mistakes of the banks. So we'll have to see how that develops. I'm not holding out much hope that we're going to see a massive change in this crony capitalist system, because as I said, the government are run by the banks, And yeah, I mean, the politicians, they make a tidy bit of money from the banks, so the current setup, well, it's in their interest, isn't it? They can make as much noise as they like about finding a more moral capitalism, but is it really going to happen whilst they're receiving backhanders, whilst they often find employment with financial companies when they leave office? Well, I don't think so. Let's move on to some other stories. Iran, of course, always in the news these days. Very important. What's happening in Iran? Well, quite an interesting story that came out yesterday is relating to China. China's always been seen as an ally of Iran. But here's a story from the Telegraph. Well, it's titled, "China begins to turn against Iran." I mean, I think that's an inaccurate headline, because I don't really think they're turning against Iran. It seems that they're just trying to protect their own interests. The Chinese premier, Wen Jiabao, has been visiting the Gulf and doing a tour of the Gulf, and he was in Saudi Arabia. Now, what this relates to, of course, is the fact that the US and the EU are basically threatening to enforce an embargo on Iranian oil, which is kind of a very odd move, because the West, is dependent on Iranian oil. Particularly the southern European countries, apparently. Spain, Greece and Italy are the biggest consumers of Iranian oil in Europe. So, at a time when the euro is near to collapse, primarily because of these countries in the south of Europe who, haven't managed their budgets, it seems very odd that the leaders of the EU and of the US are prepared to risk, these countries falling into even greater economic trouble through this proposed embargo, which I believe is going to be voted on in a few days' time. So yes, China are there, basically because of their own interests. They're also one of the biggest users of Iranian oil, and as Iran has been threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which I believe, is it a third or is it a half of the entire global output of oil travels, they're worried about their own sources of oil. So yes, after a visit to the Gulf, in which he met the leaders of the states most threatened by Iran's aggressive foreign policy, Wen Jiabao, the Chinese premier, issued Beijing's clearest condemnation yet. China adamantly opposes Iran developing and possessing nuclear weapons, he said. China appears to have sent a message to Iran that it could not rely on Beijing's unstinting support by reducing its imports of oil at a time when the US and Europe are promoting an embargo on the country. So it's quite interesting, I really hope this doesn't kind of encourage the neocons who are currently clamoring for an attack on Iran, because China, as I said, has been seen as an ally of Iran, and I would have thought that the potential for China to enter any future military conflict would have been a strong reason for the West not to attack Iran. But now the Premier's coming out and saying things like this, yeah, it's pretty worrying, really. The West has said if the Strait of Hormuz is closed by Iran, that will be tantamount to a declaration of war. I mean, how they can say that, I really don't know. I mean, how closing a 20-mile stretch of sea is an act of war is rather puzzling, but yes, it is anyway, apparently. So yeah, it's pretty worrying stuff. I mean, we all know that there's a covert war being waged against Iran already. There's no overt war yet, no military strikes, but in previous shows I've talked about the various covert methods that are being used against Iran. Of course, there's a cyber war going on with the Stuxnet virus. There's the multiple assassinations, or shall we just say murders, of Iranian nuclear scientists. There's the funding of armed extremist opposition groups in Iran by the West. So there's definitely an overt war, a covert war, being waged against Iran. And yeah, we seem to have been talking about this for a long time, but it's just pretty worrying, Read an interesting article last week about the Strait of Hormuz and how if a war was fought there, basically it's quite likely that Iran could win a war that was based solely in the Strait of Hormuz. They've got a lot of weaponry that they could simply direct towards the Strait of Hormuz. Yes, worrying times. And if Iran does indeed block the Strait of Hormuz, this is going to have a massive effect on the global economy, because so much oil comes out of that area. The global economy is already on the verge of a depression, and this would simply tip it over the edge if the Strait of Hormuz was shut down. So this leads me on to something that I wanted to talk about again, which is basically preparation for an economic collapse or an economic depression. I've talked about this in previous shows, and I've talked about it so much that I've looked at what I'm doing myself, and I've decided that really I wasn't doing enough to prepare for this depression that I've been talking about the possibility of. So I've really started to try and get my act together and to start preparing for this economic depression, which is something that I would really encourage everybody who's listening to this and who hasn't done so to do. I know the regular listeners here are kind of well up on this and are preparing, but if you're listening to this and you haven't done anything to prepare for the possibility of an economic collapse or an economic depression, then I would really urge you to do so. It really does cause cognitive dissonance, this idea of an economic collapse or an economic depression. I'm well aware of that, and I really feel it myself, because we've been so used, well, certainly during my lifetime, of having access to basically whatever we want. I personally haven't experienced poverty. I've been poor, for example, when I was a student, but I've certainly not experienced abject poverty ever. And the idea of actually possibly being in that situation is just so kind of hard to get your head around. Well, it is for me anyway. I don't know whether it's the same for you, but yeah, it causes cognitive dissonance. That's all I can describe it as, really. When you've been used to a certain situation your whole life, and when the mainstream media as well is, you know, pushing the idea that this is simply a recession and that there is a possibility that things are going to improve next year or whatever. You know, when the media sells a lifestyle to you constantly, which is, you know, a lifestyle of comfort, a lifestyle of consumerism and materialism, the idea that you could possibly be facing a, you know, economic hardship and a depression is really, it's really difficult to get your head around. But you know, the way I look at it is, even if this doesn't happen, it's still worth preparing. Like, what are you going to lose through storing food, storing water, stocking up on items that you might take for granted at the moment, but that in a future economic collapse would be, you know, very important to have. Yeah, so let me just pull up an article which details some of the things that you can be doing to prepare for this kind of situation. I mean, of course, food and water are the most important things. So storable food, you know, get down to your supermarket, stock up on tinned goods, obviously. You know, get loads of beans and stuff like that, pasta, rice, all kinds of foodstuffs that you can store and that will last for a long time. Yeah, just buy them now. I mean, what have you got to lose? You know, food is just going to rise in price anyway, and you're always going to need to eat it. So yeah, it's just insurance. I mean, it's insurance against the worst possible situation. But even if that doesn't occur, which I think it's going to, because I don't really see how it can't happen, you know, the only way that this economy could be saved is if the debt was totally wiped out, the debt that the Western nations are in, and that's not going to happen, obviously. So yeah, store food, clean water, of course. You can, you know, buy water containers pretty cheaply on eBay, like 20-litre, 25-litre water containers for £5 or £7 or whatever. So it would definitely be worth buying a few of those, and yeah, filling those with water. Obviously you have to put in a little bit of bleach, a tiny bit of bleach, if you're storing that for a long time, otherwise it'll go bad. You can buy water purification tablets on eBay pretty cheaply. I think I got some for I got like 50, which can purify 50 litres of water for like a few quid. So well worth investing in some tablets like that, water purification tablets. I mean, there's a whole list of things here. I'll drop this link into the chat room. It's from the economiccollapseblog.com. I'll just drop that in now. The article is entitled 20 Things You Will Need to Survive When the Economy Collapses and the Next Great Depression Begins. So they're quite certain about what's going to happen. So yeah, some other items that they mention, shelter, of course, warm clothing, an axe for getting firewood, lighters or matches. This was something else that I just bought, actually. I just bought a load of lighters, as well as things that are going to be useful personally that I can use myself. You know, I thought it would be good to have items that would be easily barterable in an economic depression. And yeah, I thought like disposable lighters would be a good idea. People are always going to need disposable lighters, and I think they would be items that would be in high demand in that kind of situation. And you can get these things like so cheaply. So, you know, I bought like 50 lighters for £5, and yeah, the same with food. You know, even if you don't need them in this situation and it doesn't happen, well, you're still going to need lighters in the future, aren't you? So if you buy them now, you're going to save some money because the prices of goods is going to be rising through inflation, so you haven't lost out really. Hiking boots or comfortable shoes, a flashlight or lantern, a radio, communication equipment, a Swiss Army knife, personal hygiene items, things like toothbrushes, toothpaste, toilet paper, soap, all very important things. First aid kit, other medical supplies. You can buy, things like aspirin or ibuprofen really cheaply, so it will well be worth stocking up on things like that. Extra gasoline, a sewing kit, self-defense equipment, that's a good one. I don't want to fearmonger or anything, but if it does come to a situation like an economic collapse, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to want to steal what you have, and you're going to need some self-defense equipment. We're not allowed guns obviously in Britain, but you could buy air guns, or an air pistol. You can get pretty powerful air pistols which aren't too expensive, or I guess you could get more primitive weapons, like a slingshot or something like that. A compass, a hiking backpack. I'm not one of these bug out kind of guys. You see these people on YouTube who talk about bugging out. I really can't imagine myself bugging out. I think in a really bad situation, I just want to stay at home, and I certainly wouldn't want to run off into the wild. that would be kind of a foolish thing to do for me, because I really don't have any survival skills. I think I'd last a lot longer in a house than I would camping out in the wild, put it that way. Number 19, a community, and then number 20 is a backup plan. So yes, definitely worth putting some time into making these preparations, investing a little bit of money now whilst you can, storing that food away, stuff like that. In fact, if you go to the resistradio.com website, I've just started a new thread on the forum which is all about this, about preparing. So I would encourage you to go there. We've only got a couple of posts on there at the moment, but if you've got any other ideas, please go to the forum and share them with the rest of us. Stick some links in the forum to things that you think would be good to have in a depression. That'd be most appreciated.